Thanks for joining, everybody. My name is Scott Bolden. I'm head of community and product evangelism here at Product Word. I want to introduce Jess McMullin. Jess is the founder of Situ Strategy, a human-centered management consultancy, and also the Center for Citizen Experience, an action, education, and advocacy initiative that helps the public sector work better for people. His 20 plus years of trailblazing work in user experience and service design have included co-founding the IA Institute, the Overlap Innovation Retreat, Can UX, the Canadian User Experience Workshop, acting as a co-chair for the IA Summit, and a bounty of work in his days back at Inform User Experience, where he created the famous UX trading cards, and where I had the pleasure of working alongside him as well as a colleague. Today, he speaks and leads public and in-house workshops around the world and can be found training, coaching, and consulting with leaders and teams to grow their own internal capability and culture for tackling complex challenges. Jess, welcome.
Thanks so much, Scott. Well, thanks so much for having me, and glad to be with everybody this morning, and good to connect with Scott. A little bit of a reunion. Really an opportunity to reflect on some of the fantastic things that happened in some of those foundational years for user experience and service design work. I have a little bit of a confession before we really get started, which is I've been in a cave for the last 4 or 5 years, even before the pandemic. I actually used to speak really broadly across the world, and that kind of faded a little bit when I joined as a consultant with Alberta's Digital Innovation Office. I was person number 5. We're now at 500 people. We have 50 plus product teams and a pretty significant digital spend. And so I work and coach with a number of those teams, as well as working across on ways of working for all of them. And that was a little bit of a refresh for me to focus on public sector after working with banks and telcos and tech companies when Scott and I were together. But that I'm starting to come out from my cave now and to reconnect more with the community. And really, I would love to connect with you if you reach out and connect on Twitter, Instagram, or Mastodon, or LinkedIn. That would be fantastic. I'll show these again at the end, but look forward to connecting both with old friends and new friends. We're here today to talk about designing resilient products, and I've really found my practice at the intersection of service design and product for the last 6 or 7 years. When we're thinking about resiliency, it's not always the first thing that we're thinking about in terms of our priorities or what we need to focus on, but it becomes a really fundamental value. So we're going to talk about what I mean by resiliency, because there are different facets of that. We're going to talk about why it matters beyond the cocktail party understanding of that. And then we're going to finish up with some actual how-to methods that I use with teams when we're trying to think about resiliency in their products. So first part, resiliency means lots of different things to different people. And when I think about resiliency in a product or service, it continues to provide value in the face of the unexpected. So it's really something that when something goes wrong, then your product or service can continue or recover as quickly as possible to provide value for customers and for your company. And so there's 4 facets when we're thinking about resiliency and how you build resiliency. The first one is that you can just be strong. You can resist the unexpected and endure it. An example of that was during COVID in Alberta, there were some initial COVID benefits. The very first instance of that was overwhelmed and had a terrible user experience and crashed for days on end. Recently, there is a very similar program for affordability that was stood up, and both from a user experience and an infrastructure point, stood up to 150,000 people using it on the first day. So it was a strong experience. But we can also have a flexible experience. So we can bob and weave to be able to adapt to things that come our way. And we really see this in things like agile development, being able to pivot in our priorities. And I suspect many of you are involved in teams that have that kind of flexibility and adaptiveness. But we also want to build that at a level of an organization and within our product. Resiliency is also about being ready, about being prepared, so that you actually have the things on hand and the understanding to be able to respond when something goes off the rails. And finally, resiliency is about repairability. When something does go wrong, how easy is it to fix? I've worked with a lot of enterprise legacy systems over my career, and a lot of them don't exhibit this kind of resiliency. If something goes wrong, then there's a bunch of archaeology that has to happen. And so if you have a real complex technical architecture with a bunch of microservices talking to each other and something goes wrong, or you have a complex partner network or high touch channels that have high costs, then thinking about how can you repair those things is an important aspect of resiliency. So that all sounds great, but who wouldn't want to be resilient? And this is one of the takeaways, is that all good things are trade-offs. There's the opposite principle. So for a principle to be meaningful in your life or your organization, it has to offer a choice. So you can't just choose something like to say, we want to be profitable. So, okay, that's good. But if your alternative is to be unprofitable, then that might not last very long. And so when we're thinking about resiliency, it might have some opposites. There might be some considerations, especially with your leadership or your colleagues. When you're thinking about resiliency, you really are making some choices between good things. It's asking if cold or hot is better, and it kind of depends on where you're at. So maybe the opposite of resiliency is fast, or maybe the opposite of resiliency is innovation, because you're kind of focused on making where you're at more resilient rather than building new. So you don't get that same velocity on your roadmap. And so there can be those hesitancies around thinking about resiliency in your design and product work. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the reasons that resiliency is important before we get into how to do it. But the methods that we're going to talk about are fairly light touch and not massive investments. Thinking about why resiliency is important, there's 3 root causes that add up to one kind of headline moment. So the 3 root causes are, first off, that we live in a VUCA world. You might not have heard this acronym before, or maybe you have, but VUCA comes out of the Pentagon and military planning, and it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's very hard to predict what's going to happen next. We certainly see that with the pandemic and the inflation that's followed on with that, or with things like ChatGPT and LLMs. So we get those kinds of disruptions in our world. The second one is that no product is an island. If you're going to have customers, if you're going to have partners and suppliers, then you're going to be exposed to that kind of complexity. And the third is that not all paths are happy. A lot of times, because of the pace that we're working at, we focus on the happy path, and sometimes people are struggling or things aren't working out for them. And so when we put those 3 things together, that we live in a VUCA world, that no product is an island, and that not all paths are happy, that kind of comes up to a conclusion, which is that the oh shit moment is absolutely guaranteed. You are going to run into some point in your product or service or life where there is the complete moment where your heart's in your throat and you're incredibly anxious because of something that has gone significantly wrong that you didn't expect. We all know that moment, both personally and probably professionally. And while we're focused on the happy path, that we have to be able to also place some bets on resiliency. You have to believe that resiliency is actually going to pay off, because that VUCA world guarantees you're going to have turbulence. It's more a question of when and how much rather than if it's going to happen or not. The payoff, though, is backloaded for resiliency design. It comes from things like lower support costs, a better overall user experience, brand reputation, and better staff morale, right? If you're prepared for something and you can address it and you have the tools to do that, that is much better than if you are thrown into the fire without any preparation when you're working somewhere that is undergoing challenges with resiliency. We talk a lot in our community around failing fast. And that's maybe a different conversation that we should maybe reframe as learning, but fail fast, but not too much. There's only a certain degree of failure that a system can tolerate before it breaks. And that's true of your product, your company, or your career. So how much do you invest to avoid that? One side note about trying to contain failures is there's a paradox of customer experience failures. And this is an interesting takeaway. People actually have greater brand loyalty when their customer experience goes wrong and you fix it. And because they've built a relationship of trust with you compared to if everything goes smoothly and they don't have any interactions with your company. But the takeaway of saying, why do we need to invest in resiliency, is we do have to balance resiliency with all our other priorities. And so we're weighing the cost of resiliency design less than the cost of the turbulence that we might anticipate. Then it makes sense to make some investments there. But if it's the other way around, then we can be thinking about where we could put some other priorities instead of investing in that resiliency work. Resiliency is a lot like accessibility. If you have looked at accessibility in your product or service, is that if you build it in, it's more like a little bit at a time rather than being a massive effort. And so it really isn't that much of a burden if you think about it as part of your regular practices. And it is iterative. So even if you have a mature product or organization, you can start to build this. We're going to spend some time talking about how, with some tools for resiliency design, and then we'll have some time for conversation. Thinking about how to design for resiliency, there's a whole cycle of designing for resiliency that if we had a whole day, we could talk about. But this cycle comes out of some research and practices. There's a whole field of resiliency and recovery that is grounded in largely critical systems. And so we need to be able to anticipate and figure out what's coming. We need to be able to rehearse to understand what our response is going to be and to get that preparation so that we're going to be ready. And then we need to do what we can in advance to mitigate the challenges that we see. And then keep an eye to be able to know when something's going wrong. Because if you don't notice when something is going wrong, then it gets much, much worse, right? The earlier we can detect a problem, the easier it is to deal with. And have that capacity to respond to it. And once that immediate response is on, how do you recover? How do you actually get back to the state that you want to be in? And then how do you learn from that? How do you reflect on that experience? And how are you going to prepare yourself in the future? And that fuels, again, that anticipation so that you can anticipate additional things based on what you've gone through. Of course, we don't want to always just think about the last crisis. We need to think about what might be coming down the pipe. But certainly for me, the pandemic has affected everything in terms of considerations, whether it's in tech or in nonprofits or in public sector delivery. We're going to talk mostly about things from that first two stages in anticipate and rehearse. So the first one we're going to talk about is failure mode and effects analysis and failure prototyping. And this you can think of as a product crash test. A lot of times, if you're buying a car or you're learning about a car, you're going to see things like concept cars that look really cool at an auto show and are there to get press attention, or different features that have been built, or that there's some kind of advance in self-driving or cruise, and you get a lot of sales and marketing that comes with that. What we're looking at here is actually not to think about a prototype as a way to sell or validate market demand or to improve usability. Here, we're going to take our prototype and we're going to beat it up. Just like we want our cars to get a crash test to be able to reveal how well they're functioning, we also want to be able to do that same thing with our products. And so failure mode and effects analysis comes out of critical systems work, and we're going to talk about a fast guerrilla version. Failure modes are just different ways that failure can occur. They're like the category of failure. This comes from things like nuclear power plants and the electrical grid and military systems, and now things like our banking system, thinking about the payment networks that we have for Visa or PayPal, or the underlying infrastructure for some of our large tech companies. And so traditional failure mode analysis that comes out of that engineering approach is to have a team of experts, and they work to analyze the system in depth to identify as many failures as possible. And then they look to categorize those failures and dig down into why does that happen and what would the impact be if it did happen. And then working as a group, they'll score those into something called an RPN, a risk priority number. We're taking the severity, how bad is it, the frequency, how often is it happening, and detection, like we just talked about a minute ago around observation, is being able to actually know that thing is happening so you can respond. If you score each of those things on a 10-point scale, you get an RPN out of 1,000. And then you can start to rank your priorities in terms of addressing where you're going to focus that mitigation effort and build your observability into your system. Now, this process can take months or years, depending on the system, and a fairly significant investment and a team with a cross-section of expertise, and really is beyond what most of us can justify in the work that we're doing. So we can think about a faster version of that. The fast version of this, instead of digging into the system itself, going in and looking at the code in your product, doing a bunch of field research and analytics, and being able to look at your sales numbers and all the places in your conversion funnel, is that you're just going to look at a prototype that represents the whole product, or an artifact that represents the whole product or service as a reference model. And because you need to have everybody on the same page, you're going to bring together a group of people to brainstorm product or service failures individually, just writing one failure per sticky note or index card and doing some rounds of that in 2 or 3 minute bursts. And the more complex, you might need to actually have some different representations or different artifacts to capture the full range of your offering. And you might need to do this in multiple rounds, but you are just doing a quick kind of looking at what we have as a prototype, then where do I see problems that could happen? And we gather all of those cards or stickies, and we do a card sort. We categorize and cluster them together, or you could create a clustering or theming in Miro or with physical sticky notes. And so then you're going to have groups of different kinds of related failures, and you're going to name those groups. So what is in common? And that's that identification of a failure mode. And you can just at a glance look at the size of those clusters to be able to see how much did we think about this kind of failure? And you can get a sense of how well anticipated that is. Now, just because it's a big cluster doesn't mean that it's necessarily the most important one, but that's a really quick rule of thumb that you can start to have those conversations. And that ends up being something that helps you just have that anticipation. In hearing that description, you might have encountered premortems before, and a premortem is kind of the same thing, but it's really focused on a project. So as you're kicking off a project, you're thinking about, when we're done, what might have caused us to fail in that project. And with failure mode and effects analysis, which has its roots back in World War II, we're really looking at the product or service itself and how it might fail. So when we think about having that reference or a failure prototype, it's really about showing the range of the whole thing. It's a horizontal prototype rather than a vertical prototype that's really looking in depth at some places. And so you need to have that common visual reference so that the team is able to locate or identify where in your product or service they would expect this failure to happen, rather than just sort of ambiguous, oh, things could be bad, that we want to be specific. And so that's why not only do we need to sit there and brainstorm, you could just get it into a room or into a Zoom call and do that kind of ideation, but you really need to have a reference to ground that brainstorming. And by the way, brainstorming always better when you start solo and then merge. With a failure prototype, if you're short for time, you can prep it in advance or use existing artifacts if you are just going to try this out. But even better is if you can build that model or that reference together, so that not only do you have that representation of your whole system, but you have everybody's perspective on it who is involved. But that does take a lot more time. And here's some things that I've used. Wire flows. By the way, Matt Leacock, who designed the game Pandemic, was at AOL when he invented these. And then I called them wire flows in the trading cards that Scott mentioned. So you can have a reference of your whole product like this. You can have a blueprint or an experience map, and that might be a literal physical blueprint if you're doing work in the physical world, like Internet of Things, like a voice-activated something, or different kinds of sensors, or digital enablement of physical services. And it might be a more traditional service blueprint of thinking across the journey. What are the different things that people and systems are doing in different roles? Or you might be looking at an experience map. So one of the original experience maps that Adaptive Path formalized. Or you might do a tabletop model, which is my favorite way to do this because it's so democratic. You can have everybody around the table and creating that view of the system, whether it's a physical system like this, or it's more of a flow or process representing the different facets of your system, or the kind of system map of your product or service. And that's a systems thinking, not necessarily a technical thinking, though I have had clients use this even for things like technical architecture to show API connections between different technical services. You can also do things like storyboards if you have a comprehensive end-to-end narrative of that journey and being able to line up with that. So you can use a lot of things as that grounding, but having that kind of prototype with that fast failure mode, you're having that common visual reference, brainstorming things that can go wrong, and then categorizing and clustering them to name your failure modes. And then from that, we can start to build some things to be able to rehearse from what we've done to anticipate. So just by a thumbs up in the reaction, who is using personas here or has used personas? Personas are a really common tool And here's a kind of a counterintuitive insight about personas is that not all your users like you. Not all your users are not like you. That's also true. You are not your user, but not all your users like you. And that might be generally, or it might be in the moment. A really interesting way to introduce resiliency is to create adversarial personas. So usually when we create a persona, they kind of follow the FAQ model. We wish people would ask us these questions like, how can I sign up for the enterprise version of this service? As opposed to, what are you seeing in ROI from your clients? Or how easy is it to get a hold of a real person if I subscribe to your service? Which, of course, in our SaaS world, we're really trying to minimize that support burden. So there's this kind of competing win condition sometimes. So most of our personas, though, are focused on saying this person wants to do a job to be done or a goal that our product or service helps them do. And here's some of the situations that we'd find ourselves in. So we can take our regular kind of personas. These are some hotel personas. And we can take them off the happy path. So these folks have all the regular kinds of persona things, but they also might have some issues. And so I end up adding those as an extra section and often on a separate page where there's different kinds of scenarios that represent different problems and different kinds of frustrations or attitudes that they might be bringing to the table that you can almost think of as a plot twist. But you can think of them as a regular persona, but then they might bring something that makes it a much more difficult experience than what you would expect. Adversarial personas are there to keep you on your toes and to give you a bit of a reality check of folks who aren't on the happy path. And one example of that is I have a relative who hates voice assistants in the home. He really doesn't like Alexa. And sometimes he's visiting my house and we have an Alexa because I try to keep up with interesting technology stuff. And sometimes he's pretty uncomfortable. It's not always a happy path. And it changes our behavior and it changes not only his use where he's not actually interested in using it, but it changes how everybody else might use that tool. And we're actually more reluctant to use it and avoid it, and sometimes have even unplugged it because we have a visitor who isn't comfortable with that technology. And so it could be something mild like that, or it could be something who is actively seeking to exploit you through fraud or through compromising your security or through harassing other users if you have a community or a social aspect to your product. And so lots of things that our happy path doesn't represent. And so we can add those. And when we're thinking about that, we want to humanize those personas with real challenges and difficulties and imperfections. You know, none of us here on this call are perfect. We all have our bad days. And sometimes we might be the adversarial persona in the people that we're working with. And when we're creating adversarial personas, think back to the failure modes that you've identified in that fast failure mode analysis. And you do want to keep those persona twists separate from the regular persona listing because it's really much more effective for sometimes introducing those personas without revealing the plot twists in advance. So you don't want to watch the movie when you've already seen all the plot twists. It's not as fun. But when you are creating personas, we don't want to use stereotypes. We don't want to be silly. We shouldn't make this a joke. And you don't want to be so extreme that your persona doesn't generalize. There's a whole other conversation about considering extreme users, but this isn't the place for that. And so you can bring those personas then into red team scenarios. And so this is well beyond the kind of critique that designers will do or the feedback that we'll get from our colleagues. This is coming out of red teaming from the military, where they'll do military exercises where there is a red team that represents the adversary or the enemy who is trying to overcome and beat the blue team representing your actual military country. Red teaming has actually been adopted quite strongly in IT security, thinking, how do we make our systems more resilient and bulletproof? And so we're taking some of that same mentality into product management and design. We take those personas and we can run through different scenarios, and you can think about, well, if somebody is coming into our product with these kinds of things, how are they going to respond to it? Particularly, being able to role play that and have somebody take on that persona is really effective. So you can go into the field, and I have spent a few projects where I'm basically on site and making adjustments and seeing things in a physical location for designing a service model. But also you can do body storming, where you're role-playing those different considerations, or you can do that kind of tabletop modeling where you're applying that persona to then look at this. A lot of the most value that I see is really from that rehearsal of actually having people take on different roles in the system. Customer success, customer support, marketing, and that can be people. It can also be different aspects of the system. So if you have a chatbot, somebody could actually be the chatbot and then respond to maybe somebody trying to hack the chatbot, if you've seen ChatGPT. So you have one or more people take on that adversarial persona, and you want to keep the plot twists private, because the rest of the team is a lot more effective if they don't know in advance what kind of things might be coming at them, and then walk through different scenarios that represent those different failure modes. I'm a huge fan of improv, but your folks might not be comfortable with that. So it could be more like talking through, but improv is actually going to embody it and actually cement it better with your team. And then debriefing after the scenario to think about how might you mitigate. When you go through this kind of exercise, you're thinking about the different elements of your product or service. So you have these different components of the service system, and you can score them across the different scenarios that you work. Having walked through it, you can get a sense of, is it low, very low, or neutral, or positive, or very positive? I score on a 5-point scale, but -2 to 2. And then you can add these numbers up. And what you end up is, if you add the numbers in a row, you'll get the sum on that right-hand side. Then you get a sense of how resilient that part of your product or system is. And when you add the numbers in the column, then you get a sense of how resilient your whole product or service is in that given scenario. And then you can look across your scenarios and see how resilient you're feeling with those different aspects of it. So just to wrap up the talking part, we live in a VUCA world. No product is an island, and not all paths are happy, but we can actually do things. We can actually be active in designing for resiliency with tools like fast failure mode analysis, adversarial personas, and red team scenarios to be able to defend against those oh shit moments. And when you're designing for resiliency, you can improve the performance of your organization when you're facing that kind of turbulence and sometimes some rocky things ahead. And your customers, your partners, and your staff are going to be better when you've given some consideration to resiliency, when things actually inevitably stray from the happy path. So thank you so much for having me today. Look forward to a little bit of a conversation here, and would be very happy to hear from you, whether it's in any of these flavors. Certainly, if you're interested in a copy of the deck and some of the resiliency templates around those three methods, a little bit more in-depth how-to guide, one-pager, and the resiliency matrix, then drop me a note and would be happy to flip that over to you. So thanks again for having me. And I think we have a little bit of time to chat.
Thanks, Jess. Really appreciate it. I think a lot of good comments in here. People going, wow, never thought of things from this angle. And I think it's opened up some different perspectives for people, which is really wonderful to see. I do encourage people to pop your questions in the Q&A. We'd love to leave the time that we've got here to talk a little bit to Jess about stuff. Maybe I'll kick things off though, Jess. Maybe you could share just a little story of something that you've done maybe recently where you applied this resilience patterns to the work that you've done, and not maybe the takeaways from it, but were there any aha moments maybe that kind of stood out?
So sometimes you just find things that surprise you. And that's one of the challenges with that fast failure mode analysis, is that the very first things that you write down are not surprises. There's just the top of mind things that you understand. And that's why you're doing those multiple rounds, those bursts or the ideation sprints in 2 or 3 minutes, is because once you exhaust the stuff that is top of mind, you start to push into some novel territory. And when you're looking at that prototype, then you get some new ideas. How might that go off the rails? One example, we have a system for land titles, right? If you're going to purchase a property, then you need to transfer the title from the seller to the buyer. And we have an online service to be able to do that. People can go and enter the information to be able to do that. Just guess in the chat the adoption rate of our self-serve option versus sending in a paper package. I just want to see. 38% adoption rate. There's 80% adoption rate because self-serve is way more convenient, right? Steve is actually right. It is 4%, 4% adoption rate. And the interesting thing, because we knew that there was a problem there, and so we're looking at exploring that and then validated it through actual field research. But a lot of the system had been designed thinking about lawyers. So usually you're not transferring the title, whoever is doing the legal side of your deal is. And so in thinking about lawyers, people had overlooked paralegals. And so a paralegal who has to write up all this stuff and to create that package actually has to do it in the law firm's own software, because they're using software to both write up the deal and to handle the financial transaction of, oh, you've got a massive check from the bank and we've got to get it over to the other party. And so they've already entered everything, and we're asking them to turn around and enter all that same information again. So that was something where we're like, oh, there's something going on here. And maybe it's because of that experience that paralegals have, because we've focused so much on lawyers. And then we're able to go out and do field research and actually say that is actually true. So it can help you to generate a hypothesis that you can then go out and validate in the world.
Yeah, I guess in some ways, maybe they were the adversarial persona that you were talking about.
And not that they have any bad intent, but we're essentially putting this obligation on them to do double entry. And of course, being aware of that, now we can actually do more to address it.
How many challenges, difficulties should we put per user persona? What are some of the categories you might suggest to start with for those challenges or difficulties?
So when you do that fast failure mode analysis, these 3 things that we talked about are in order. And so you need to do the failure mode analysis before you do the personas, and that will give you a sense of the range of problems and challenges that you might anticipate. I took out a slide that is actually a hierarchical tree of kinds of failure. And there's three big categories of failure. So one of them is just something goes wrong with the system or with an external factor, like there's a bug or an outage, or your competitor comes out with something, or COVID happens. Then there's a category where there's a problem from a customer's perspective that is either caused by the customer, or the third category or way of thinking about that is caused by your own staff. So does the person have an unreasonable demand, or are they drunk, or are they trying to actually defraud you? So let's say for like any e-commerce, if you manage your own payment infrastructure, you have to expect that people are going to try to exploit that, not only technically to hack into it, but are there ways that they could be doing something interesting? I just discovered a letter that I got from when I was in university. I found a change machine at the Student Union building. If you fed it a $5 bill, it gave you $10 in change. And so I fed it a $5 bill. I was like, what is going on? I did it again because it's like, is this like a one-time thing? It's, oh no, now I have $20 for my $10. So I actually phoned the company and said, you need to come fix this. And they sent me a letter back. I sent them a check for the $10 and they returned it. But there's other ways to exploit the system. If you're a casino, how do you keep people from being able to do that? So you can think about the kinds of things that you have. One of the things that I see all the time is your competitor as an adversarial persona, who may be not only your competitor in an abstract way in the market that you're competing for share, but might actually sign up for an account and come in and either grief your community or steal your features or other things like that. And so some people get a little bit too competitive, I think. But look to that failure mode analysis to really ground the kinds of things. As far as the number goes, 3 or 4 or 5 scenarios, but more about that sense of frustration or the kinds of frustration they might be bringing. Just like there's with the paralegals, we're putting an extra burden on them where somebody who's going to come and grief your community is actively opposing you. They might not enact the exact scenario that you've anticipated. That's more of like how to think about that person getting that character. All right.
We'll leave some time for anybody else that has any questions come in, but I'll jump in with another one. I know a lot of teams, obviously in the downsizing or resizing of tech these days, are seeing people depart from their teams. And as a result, maybe in some cases they don't have resiliency or they haven't thought about these kinds of things. How do you basically backtrack when you don't have it? Is it like going through these same exercises now as maybe the new team that's left there? Or how could teams maybe think a little more future forward and plan for that resiliency, being smaller, more nimble, whatever it might be?
So I think there's sort of 2 aspects of this. One of them is what you've suggested here, is that in adapting to a reduced capacity, you might not have some particular roles or depth anymore. Then you can think about these kinds of things to say, how can we become more resilient given our current situation? The other aspect, and I wish this happened more, and this is a kind of a leadership question, is to consider the resiliency impacts when you are making those kind of organizational decisions to downsize, because it can be easy to think about efficiency and trying to get as lean as possible, but you actually become a less effective organization if you don't have a little bit of slack. And we see that in things like Kanban and work in progress, but we also see that as a principle in an organization as a whole. So thinking about what are the things that maybe aren't the everyday kind of thing, but that we should still be retaining some capacity. I think we sometimes go overboard in that kind of trimming, but I'm usually not in that C-suite. So when they ask me, I'll let them know.
Thank you, Jess. I really appreciate this. I think this is super insightful. Hope people found lots of value from it. I think there's lots of great comments and thumbs up and things like that. And I'm glad we could reconnect again as well and just get you back sharing some stuff and getting out of the supposed cave, as you talked about earlier. We're going to wrap things up. I have shared a link in the chat for the post-event survey. If you could take a moment and share your feedback. I know Jess would love it, and so would we. We try to make these events better each time based on this feedback, and you can also win our monthly prize draw. If you want to continue the conversation on this, feel free to make a post in our community. Our community, by the way, is moving from our current platform to Slack later this month. We have lots of events coming up. Next week, we're talking with Gabriel Steinhardt. We've got Timothy Kretschel coming up, and then our mini conference as well this month. And speaking of that mini conference, we have 12 amazing speakers as part of that, talking about how they're supercharging their work, thinking big, working collaboratively, and really dealing with these challenging times. If you do have some wisdom, some experiences, something about your product practices that you'd love to share with us, feel free to get in touch. You can just search for Speak within our community. We'd love to have you. We're always looking for new people to participate, share their knowledge. Thanks very much again for joining us. And thank you again, Jess. Really great to see you again. And have a wonderful Thursday. Take care.
Thanks, Scott. See ya.